This is The Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America with senior economists Mihir Torsekar and Andrew Rechenberg.
In steel, a single Chinese company, Baowu, makes more than every mill in America combined. In aluminum, China now outproduces the rest of the world put together, while the United States, once the global leader as recently as 2000, is down to just 4 smelters. And in copper, China has built so much refining capacity that its smelters now pay miners just to take their ore, while America has almost none left. These are the metals every warship and fighter jet is built from, and we stopped making them. And this wasn't an accident. Today our guest explains how we let that happen. Welcome to the Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where each week we break down the 3 biggest stories shaping U.S. trade, industrial policy, and the American economy. I'm Mihir Torsekar alongside my fellow senior economist Andrew Rechenberg. So let's get to it. So today we're joined by Ben Carlson, one of the authors of a new report out from the SAFE Center for Strategic Industrial Materials called Strategic Surpluses, China's Economic Warfare on Major Metals. Ben and his co-authors did something we think is really valuable. So they argue that overcapacity in China isn't just a bug in the system, it's actually the system itself. China keeps all this loss-making capacity running on purpose because a mountain of steel, aluminum, and copper capacity churning out far more than the world can absorb is a war machine that you can keep warm in peacetime and switch on the day a fight with Taiwan begins. Ben, welcome to the Big Three. And so why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background, what led you to put this report together?
Here, Andrew, delighted to be on. Thanks for having me. So I'm from SAFE, Securing America's Future Energy. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. That works on securing America's transportation, energy, and supply chains. The motivation for the report is there's a lot of great insights out there talking about Chinese industrial policies, talking about sort of across the value chain of aluminum, steel, and copper. Great work that's been done. But, the goal for me in this report was to try and distill a lot of that and make it into a really approachable document that with the nuance kind of explains, the Chinese story when it comes to industrial policy, how they went from, a marginal producer of some of these metals to by far the world's largest producer, and how the United States, on the flip side of that, went from one of the largest producers of aluminum, steel on the planet to, now what we are today. You mentioned the stat in aluminum. We were the world's largest producers recently since the year 2000, and now I think we're the 13th largest. So just to tell that story in a nuanced way, how we got here, and what's the path back.
Great. Yeah, so I'll start right there. The title says it all of the report, and so that word strategic is really something that sticks out. So, most of the coverage about Chinese steel and aluminum, they call it overcapacity, and it seems to imply that this was kind of like a planning mistake, or they built too much, and they keep promising to fix it. They talk about these involution campaigns and things like that. But your report talks about it being something different. So I'll ask you, what convinced you and your the folks you worked with on this report, that this was that this surplus was a strategy and not just some mix-up or some mistake that they made?
Yeah, I think 2 things can be true at once, right? It can be both a mistake and a strategy. I'm not sure there's, it's the outcome that matters, right? I'm not sure the motivations are what's important here. When it comes to steel and producing more steel, I've been trying to spin out this for, going back to the Mao era, right? We had Mao Zedong, the man himself, talk about wanting to overtake the UK in steel production way back in the days of the Great Leap Forward. That's what the campaign was about. And so we've seen China just do it, right? Like they're now the largest producer. And so I think we wanted to sort of ground, okay, what's going on here, right? It's these are the metals that underpin most of modern life, whether that be infrastructure, the defense industrial base. They're too important for us to just completely let be offshored or manipulated by, frankly, Chinese industrial policies. And so, to understand how are we going to address some of these issues to make our own, industrial base or defense industrial base more resilient, we need to kind of go and understand what are the causes of that, What are the Chinese policy makers doing? How do they achieve that? And so, by and large, yeah, it's state planning, right? This is a non-market economy. They've been doing this, directly back, when it was a command economy. Now we've got a socialist market economy, so there's elements of a market economy, kind of mixed with state planning. And so, yeah, steel overcapacity is something we've been talking about a lot. You've got, you mentioned the top, like Baowu Steel. Baowu Steel doesn't make more steel than just all of the United States. Baowu Steel makes more steel than any other country except India, right? So, it's a single state-owned firm that is just, remarkable market share. We see similar challenges when it comes to aluminum. We see similar challenges when it comes to copper. Copper, the margins on smelting and refining are negative. So that's like you going into McDonald's and then paying you to eat the burgers.
Exactly.
On aluminum, right? We've got a similar sort of issue when it comes to power. China invested in all this coal, and just the nature of the grid is you got to figure out something to do with all that excess electricity capacity. And aluminum came along as a very a positive sort of demand pull for that electricity, right? It's a very attractive thing. So is it intentional? Sure, right? Like China was industrializing, they needed the metals, they wanted to grow into the world's factory, and it has paid off for them, right? Like they control how much of global trade. You guys probably have to figure out your job overhead. They're one of the largest manufacturing countries, if not the largest, and that just requires a remarkable amount of metal. But, the story of the United States so far has been steel, aluminum, copper, foundational national security. You lose these industries, you lose a key element of the defense industrial base, which, safe, we agree with. But the flip side is true, right? When all those metals are concentrated in China, and they have all of that production that could be retooled for other things, it does provide them with a degree of industrial preparedness if you would need to retool or prepare for, potential military conflict. And so, that's something that I think U.S. policymakers should be aware of, be concerned of, be tracking. And then we, also wanted to tell the nuanced story that, do I think that the Chinese wake up every day and, think about, hey, we want to screw over U.S. domestic metals products? Probably not. They're trying to think about, how do I manage, youth unemployment? How do I keep my steel workers employed? But, in their response to prioritizing those domestic interests, right? Employment, which any government would, right? You're creating and frankly exporting a problem that the whole rest of the world needs to deal with. And so I think, from our perspective is if we want to deal with that problem effectively, we really need to understand the root cause of what's going on and what the consequences of that are, both on the United States, but also on China itself.
Yeah, just to highlight the difference of what China's doing as opposed to everyone else, I wanted to play devil's advocate here for a moment, because here in the U.S., we have our certain industrial policy measures, whether it's the CHIPS Act or the IRA. Canada has power deals for aluminum smelters. The European Union has had policies to support Airbus. So I really wanted to focus on what is China doing, especially in regards to with what you're saying in your report with steel, aluminum, and copper. What are they doing that's so different that compared to every other country? What is uniquely their policies that are so damaging to this market and so different from what everyone else is engaging in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say just the top, it's the degree and the scale, right? When you've got one company that makes more steel than anyone else's output, it's remarkable, right? We're talking about, a company that has more production capacity than Germany, that's owned by the Chinese government. One of many companies owned by the Chinese government. And so, I think you're comparing apples to oranges when you compare a market economy to a non-market economy like China, right? You have a whole host of industrial subsidies, which, yes, in circumstances occur in market economies, unambiguous, right? Like we've got, sweetheart deals and for power for certain producers. We've got, every country on the planet has some type of manufacturing strategy. And so what I think where China is different is just the degree to which they subsidize. We've got charts, the OECD tracks this pretty closely, and you can just see the level of subsidy by far exceeds any other country that the OECD takes a look at when it comes to aluminum subsidies. And you see the effects of that excess capacity, like in copper smelting, right? To be clear, we absolutely need more aluminum copper, right? we're a short supply in those markets, but the areas where you see the excess capacity show up, for example, copper smelting and copper refining, it's hard to believe that a market economy, a company operating in a market economy without some type of industrial policy support, would just be able to sustain negative margins year over year over year. And it being, and the reason that's happening is because, the Chinese government is looking at it in a broader strategic, capacity. They want to dominate critical minerals, right? That is something that gives them a lot of leverage. It gives them a lot of manufacturing opportunities, right? When you're able to kind of concentrate that supply chain, the downstream products, those will concentrate in your country as well. Batteries, some of these next era, energy generation technologies. And so, it's a strategic advantage for them to have these industries in their country. I think they have acknowledged that, and they've been acknowledging that for a while. And, they have the capabilities and the means, because they're not a market economy, to just sustain policies that would not be viable, say, in the West.
Yeah, and so I guess I want to get ahead of something, we're going to hear a lot about this year. Beijing, they've talked about overcapacities, for a while now. And it seems like there's this whole anti-involution they call a campaign that they're talking about, because it's the price compressions that are happening all across their industries. And I guess, I guess I'm a little skeptical about the effectiveness of that overall, because the decision, I think that keeps, these plants running. I think it seems to happen a lot at the provincial level. The incentives seem to be, just even the way the tax system is designed, and the local governor needs to, keep the plants running for jobs and tax revenue. And I think you even have a quote from your report that in 2015, the Steel Association chief admitted that local governments they kept urging firms to produce even when the center wanted them to stop. So I guess my question is, why hasn't a decade of supply side reform rhetoric actually cut production? And, is this anti-involution campaign push that we're hearing about, is that going to be any different, or is the surplus just too wired, too deep, it's just too entrenched, into the country itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think steel in the metals sector and what we're seeing today with the anti-involution campaign is a little different, right? Because back then we were literally looking at state-owned companies, and now you have, say, excess production of electric vehicles, right? That's inherently sort of a private sector. That's something in the private sector. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, China's a billion people, they have their own politics, right? And so there's a difference between, what the central government is looking at versus, say, provincial government, right? And that quote, I think, is pretty remarkable, because it's Chinese policymakers. The head of the Iron and Steel Industry Association went on to be the mayor of Guangzhou. So, there's kind of that industry political tide there. But, it's politicians in China, it's the industry in China openly acknowledging, like, hey, this is a political process, right? What's good for the local government is making sure that people stay on the job, making sure that there's social stability. But the central government is not, I think, immune from looking at all of these policies, and, the results are probably pretty inefficient allocation of capital, right? Like, it's expensive to have all of this capacity when you don't have a real buyer for it, right? Like, there are strategic advantages too, but there are costs to it, costs borne by Chinese depositors, Chinese taxpayers ultimately. And so the central government's got to balance that. And so you're able to see why the provinces are competing with each other. You've got the central government trying to steer the ship, and so. I think for Americans, they're going to want to do something. They're going to want to reduce capacity, but it's to what end, right? We've had about a decade of them talking openly about steel excess capacity. We've had, similar conversations in the copper world about excess refining. Even if they reduce the capacity, when you have a single firm that makes more steel than anybody else on the planet, and you lose that firm, that's a lot of capacity that goes off the world. But still, China's still the largest producer in that market. And so I think there needs to be sort of a nuance of, like, okay, there are certainly measures that they could take to reduce excess capacity, but does that leave China in a position where they're not the dominant force in those markets? And I think that's really the question we should ask, right? As for what's kind of going on in the EV space, time will tell. Maybe it's different with the private sector being more in the driver's seat. But when you've got these state-owned firms and China is seemingly enjoying an advantageous position in its dominant role in critical minerals, metals, I don't see that changing anytime soon, even if there are genuine measures that reduce some of the excess within the country.
Yeah, they've built all these industries, and I think that they're very keen on kind of jealously guarding their market share at all turns, even with this sizable advantage. So, yeah, it's definitely something that I'm certainly following and very concerned about. Andrew, I'm going to have you turn it to you to transition us to the second topic about the tariffs and the policy measures that have been applied so far.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about for segment 2 why the tariffs that we've had with China haven't been fully effective. On the show we've talked a lot about different measures, whether it's transshipment or just different supply measures that it can get in, or just how a lot of the traditional trade measures aren't enough to stop the full tide. And so I wanted to see and get your take on why the Section 301 tariffs haven't been enough to stem this overcapacity from China, and what are some of the holes in this system that you've seen?
Yeah, so trade policy is, I think, fundamental to addressing this, non-market actions and the harms that they've caused out to U.S. businesses. So let me just start by saying that, right? That the conversation needs to start with trade policy holistically, but it's not enough just to look at trade policy. You need to look at it sort of holistically. I think if you look in aluminum, that's an interesting sector because China has, a cap of 45 million metric tons to address this excess capacity. But, the damage is kind of already done, right? We went from the world's largest producer to the world's 13th largest producer of primary aluminum, and we import 85% of the primary aluminum we need in the United States. And so a trade policy solution is part of the holistic industrial strategy that we should take to say, hey, we need this stuff here. This is important for the economy, for the defense industrialists, et cetera. But 40% of the cost of production of aluminum is energy. And if you don't have an energy policy conversation and you just have a tariff conversation, you're not necessarily going to get to filling that 85% gap. We have, I believe in the aluminum industry, the capacity utilization isn't great, but it's getting better. One of the reasons it got better is because we had a smelter shut down in Hawesville, right? So the capacity utilization went up, but just not in the way we wanted to. And that, smelter closed and became a data center. And so I think the holistic view that China has taken towards this metals, it's not just, tariffs. It's not just their trade policy. It's below market borrowing. It's energy policy changes, right? There's a whole host of things that lifted the Chinese economy and the Chinese metal sector into what it is today. I think if the United States wants to sort of undo some of the harms and fill the gaps that remain that maybe domestic production capacity can't fill, especially on the copper side. We have 2 smelters in copper. It's going to probably take a very nuanced whole of government industrial strategy rather than just a trade policy conversation or specifically just a tariff policy conversation.
Yeah, I think that to address the devastation that has occurred in these industries you're right. I mean, it's not just going to be like a one-trick pony of tariffs and that's just set it and walk away. We're talking about, because again, when you close a smelter, for example, it's not like you can just turn it back on when market conditions are more favorable. These are, how there have been billions of dollars of capital investments just to erect a smelter in the first place. And so generally speaking, you want to keep these facilities operating, and when they shut down, that's basically the death knell. It's not going to come back. So yeah, to try to address that is going to take so much. And I guess since we're talking about trade policy and what has kind of maybe limited in some instances the effectiveness of the tariffs, let's talk a little bit maybe about transshipment. Because we hear a lot about that word, and maybe Ben, if you can give us, some of the folks who are listening, and again, some of our members are well versed in this, but for some of the other listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, Is it ever the case that we're seeing Chinese metal that ends up reaching the U.S. steel, like through transshipment, even when the tariffs are in place? Is that a route you kind of see happening? Is that, trade diversion story something you're seeing in this industry?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly that goes on, right? And I think that's probably one of the hardest challenges in trade policy that, both the government and governments around the world who are concerned about this, pretty serious below market metal production coming out of China. How do you solve that? Because at a certain point, it does matter, right? If your overall demand, not just the demand you and your manufacturing industry today need and where you get that metal from, but if your overall demand, the stuff that's coming in embodied in a product, still, if that supply chain still runs through China, even though it's indirect, maybe that metal gets shipped down to Vietnam, processed into a product, or Mexico or Canada, it's still a challenging, environment, because that means that the metal produced in the United States isn't going to a manufacturer to be transformed into something here in the United States. And so I think it's a real challenge. I think it's challenging to figure out how big the problem is, because you really do need to go into like Mexican imports of transformers, and where do they get their grain-oriented electrical steel for, and what's the weight of a transformer, and what's the approximate percentage of the grain-oriented electrical steel. Like that is a really challenging thing to do. But
wait, you can't just put that in the chat,
right?
You can't put that into ChatGPT and just get an answer. I mean, come on. I thought it was something simple. No, you're telling me it's complicated.
And so that's why I try and say trade policy instead of tariffs, right?
Yeah.
Because I think trade policy encompasses things like rule of origin, right? Because at the end of the day, what you want is your metals demand met by U.S. and allied supply, right? We've got this state intervention, and nobody is really winning if you've got a supplier, getting in cheap Chinese metals and then bringing that to the United States as a finished good, right? All you're doing is incentivizing kind of that mid-level production and manufacturing stream to leave the United States. And so a holistic policy, a holistic industrial policy, trade policy and industrial policy, right, really looks at that, looks at the competitiveness of the metals themselves, looks at what the metal producers need to be sustainable and robust in the long term, but also looks at what are the customers, right? Because if you just tariff the metal, but you let the finished product come in, that's tariff inversion, and ultimately that's a really challenging situation. And how do you solve that? And how do you address that? And so I think a holistic trade policy would really take a look at that in a way that I think addresses some of those diversion concerns, whether that's through rules of origin or through some other novel trade policy approach. And I don't have all the answers here, but it's a real problem that it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and expanding on this, the tariff inversion problem that you were just saying, I wanted to kind of talk about this a bit more, because in my own research, we've seen this with aluminum as well, where you might have some tariffs on the primary aluminum that's coming in, but if you don't have that same protection for all the downstream products, then you could lose the whole sector. You don't even need the primary aluminum if you're just importing all the finished products as well. And I think one of the great examples from your report is the transformer issue and exactly what happened there. You touched on it a little bit, but can you expand on exactly what happened with this transformer issue and how that impacted the sector?
Yeah, so there's nothing new here. There's nothing new and novel. If you've read the Section 232 Transformer Core report that the Bureau of Industry and Security of the Commerce Department put out, you'll know all the answers. But essentially what they found in the report is that you had this challenge of, grain-oriented electric steel, for your audience, is incredibly important for the production of transformers. Transformers are the foundation of our grid, right? All 90% of electricity passes through a transformer on its journey from generation to end consumption. So the transformer is literally the heart of the grid, and the grain-oriented electrical steel in the core of the transformer is literally the heart of the transformer. So we're talking about a steel that essentially powers modern life. The challenge is, we've got a globally competitive transformer, market. We've got grain-oriented electrical steel, which is sort of the base metal. Tariffs went up on that. We had cores and laminations, which are sort of the mid product. And, what you saw under the report, which the Commerce Department investigated, is that, you had some manufacturers basically, instead of opting to buy U.S. metal, they would buy metal from overseas, process it into a third country, and then put it in a transformer in that country and then bring it in. And so it's just a classic example of tariff inversion, where the signals that you're setting to the manufacturers are to play these games, not necessarily on U.S. metals. And so the trade policy solution there is probably a really strong rule of origin, where you just look at the whole host of the value chain and you say, let's make sure we align the incentives for domestic manufacturing, not just at the metals production stage, but across the value chain. But it's also really complicated, because then you get things like, okay, aluminum cans, right? Like, if you're bringing in an aluminum can, are you gonna, tax the metal in a Coke can? So it's very challenging, and I think it gets back to some of the, it is just, at the end of the day, really, really challenging to address and mitigate the harms of subsidized base material production, right? Whether that be critical minerals or whether that be metals, because essentially it reroutes those supply chains to be dependent on, in this case, China. The market moves to who gets the most subsidy, and that's the real challenge with trying to trade with a non-market economy, is that some of those gains from trade look very attractive, but the comparative advantage is artificial, and it's based on subsidized production.
So so here, before we transition to the final segment, it's like we've kind of take inventory of what we've covered so far. So we've got this strategic surplus that's being built on purpose. We've identified the problem, and we've got policies like tariffs that are erected in place to try to prevent some of these challenges from happening. But that metal is simply just rerouting around those channels, and at the same time, our industry keeps eroding, and so the fix obviously has to be bigger than just addressing it at the border. So Ben, let's spend our last act there. If trade enforcement alone isn't going to solve the problem, I guess, what do you think will? So your report lays out a pretty comprehensive roadmap, and I don't want to just run down the list. So maybe if you can talk about some of the big things that you would like to see Washington prioritize. What's the biggest move you think that could move the needle forward on this?
Yeah, continuing the conversation on trade policy, it's an important part of the solution, right? These harms are hitting the United States through trade. Trade policy is part of that. Rules of origin that are strong, that incentivize U.S. producers and the partners we trade with to use metals from their country, from allied Western countries, market economies, process those goods into products in allied Western market economies, I think would do a lot to help us address some of the challenges, because that sort of aligns the demand with our supply, right? You're wanting to align kind of Western market-based demand with Western market-based supply. So trade policy is an important part of the solution. We mentioned energy, right? We are in an era where electricity, there's more demand for it than ever. Eventually, that's going to translate to price. And so I think, China has been very successful on the energy front. It shows in primary aluminum. And I think the United States needs more leadership when it comes to energy, right? Permitting reform, we should get it done. Mm-hmm. We should build some of those great transmission lines like they build in China, the high voltage stuff. But just generally, we need to make it easier for people to build in this country across the board. I would also say that one of the just holistically understanding the incentive structure across the value chain and where in that value chain the intervention is needed, I think is also helpful, right? It just gets back to state capacity. More nuanced policy, you can get away with smaller targeted fixes rather than, a grand bill coming out of Congress. And so, energy policy is an important part of it. We also, when it comes to metals, recycling is a great way to secure supply chains, right? We have the scrap at home. We can recycle it at home. It typically uses a fraction of the energy. You've got a shorter supply chain. You've got a win-win from an environmental and an energy perspective. And we have the benefit of not having to be reliant on some of these markets that are influenced by the Chinese and compete in the metal sector in a way that's more competitive. So when it comes to metals, I'd also say taking a really hard look at secondary production, which is where we get most of our copper, steel, and aluminum.
Yeah, Andrew, I'll turn to you in a second, but real quick, on that copper point is, the secondary side of the argument is essentially the critical feedstock for our copper mills, and they themselves are competing with the Chinese market on that front because China is, they're able to just, pay whatever for our harvest of copper scrap here, and so our mills are competing against the copper side of folks. So tariffs alone just gives you an example. That's not sufficient. At least that's just a concrete example. But Andrew, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on the power angle a little bit more, because in our own aluminum research, we've been looking at this quite a lot and just showing how for primary aluminum, electricity is about 40% of total smelting costs, and it's really holding back even our current production, with aluminum capacity utilization really only at around 53% right now. And so I wanted to ask, are you seeing this with a lot of other sectors like steel and copper as well? And not only to get our capacity utilization up, but do you think sort of a power deal is needed for these sectors, especially to open new production? Or do you think that a lot of the other measures that you've talked about, such as just making it easier to build, might be sufficient along with tariff protection?
Aluminum, specifically primary aluminum, when it comes to power, is relatively unique, right? The requirements of a primary aluminum smelter are electricity, and it's specifically 24/7 electricity. You can close a primary aluminum smelter down for about 4 hours a year. So it needs a significant amount of steady, cheap power. And to be honest with you, that's a very similar profile to what a data center needs right now. We've got a boom in data centers across the country. The risk there is that unless we have some type of a durable energy policy that sort of acknowledges, like, hey, yes, the data centers, are a unique category, but we also have other large loads that need, frankly, power at, a relatively affordable price, because they're competing in a market that is subject to a lot of industrial policy from China. If you don't solve that power problem, you're not really solving primary aluminum's fundamental competitiveness nature. Yes, tariffs, are part of that solution to just directly, address some of that unfair competition. But when it comes to the competitiveness of the sector, it's really all about the power. Within the rest of the metal sector, I think they're a little bit unique. There's a different profile. They can turn off the machines like an electric arc furnace. There's sort of more alignment with, variable power sources. And so you can kind of capture, say, cheaper sources from renewables in a way that makes a little bit more sense. But primary aluminum, that's a challenging one. And I think it just gets back to transmission, right? We have a grid. We have a lot of generation across the country, both, renewable and traditional. We just need to get that power onto the grid, and the constraint there is interconnection, and that's largely just driven by the fact that building new wires, new transmission in this country is just very challenging, and it's a long process due to permitting, planning, cost allocation, supply chain. You list it. Addressing those issues on the power side helps address those issues on the manufacturing side, which helps not just primary aluminum, but the entire manufacturing sector, period, become more competitive. So I think that is something that we really need to take a really hard look at.
So here's a question, again, on the policy front, because when we think about what it's going to take to try to compete against these state-owned enterprises and the backing of the CCP that is just funneling resources and just granting low-cost loans and just doing all of these things, pulling every lever. And you think about how much waste is also associated with this model, because sure, for all of the success, if you will, in terms of just prolific production that's being brought online in so many different sectors beyond just the sectors covered in your report, there comes with it the cost of how much you're losing on a lot of these industries. I mean, I've run this joke before. Andrew's heard me say it, like the CCP tolerates losses more than the Cleveland Browns fan base, right? I'm a football fan from Cleveland, so I'm familiar with what that looks like. But the U.S. government is a different story, and you've got fiscal hawks who look at, say, that there's no way that we can tolerate that kind of thing. I mean, it's just too much public money for some of these solutions, too much intervention. And, what do you say to the argument maybe that some people would say, well, in order to fight China's model, you have to, build China's model or mimic China's model to fight China's model, I guess?
I think when it comes to what do we do, right? Trade policy and industrial policy in the United States, I think what they're really about is creating space for market competition, right? We probably can't out-subsidize China, nor should we try. Where I think what we need to do is we need to align the incentives across value chains and across the manufacturing economy, but also where the demand comes, aligning demand with supply so that there's space on the supply side for genuine market competition. But some of that unfair market competition that comes from overseas is addressed in a way that holistically makes sense. You don't have these transshipment issues. You address some of the fundamentally issues with the energy system of the United States that are sort of dragging down competitiveness. I think if you do that, you can create an ecosystem where you don't necessarily need to endlessly subsidize producers, nor do I think that is a long-term sustainable roadmap for either the United States or China, right? Fiscally, the money ends at some point. But there are certain strategic sectors when you're at the start of this endeavor, which I think will be a multi-decade whole of government if we're going to be successful, strategy to have an industrial policy that works for American manufacturing. And there's probably an argument at the start when you're kickstarting that process. Yeah, there's going to need to be some level of state support, subsidy support, just because we have let certain aspects of our production capacity be offshore into China in a way that is just not helpful. We saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, that we did not have a great domestic capacity to make gloves or masks or respirators in this country. And and in that environment, when you really need the stuff, there's only one tool. You subsidize it and you build the factory and you make sure it gets built. But should that be the long-term solution? No, probably not. We should have some way of aligning demand with some of these strategic materials, whether they be steel or whether they be domestic PPE, so that when the next pandemic or when the next crisis hits, we can rely on that manufacturing supply. And so I think that's what gets back to it. Tariffs are a part of that solution. Trade policy is absolutely a part of that solution, but it requires a holistic industrial policy looking at the health of the manufacturing sector writ large.
It's funny that you mentioned, I'll turn it to Andrew in a second, but it's funny that you mentioned the COVID pandemic because that actually happened to be when we first actually engaged like 6 years ago. Seems like these crises just keep bringing us together. So Andrew, I'll let you ask a question if you had any thoughts before we wrap up here.
Yeah, just as we're getting towards the end, and I think that you're just touching on this a little bit at the end, but one of the things I thought the report did really well is basically reshape the framing of the trade policy issue, because I think a lot of over the past year, especially with the Liberation Day tariffs, that a lot of this trade policy seemed to be based on what's our trade deficit with all these different countries. It's very demand focused. It's very much on the consumer side. But one thing I thought this report did really well is reframe things into terms of how much can we produce in a crisis? How much could we produce if a COVID-like event happened, or if we needed it for a defense industrial base? So I just wanted to see if you could explain a little bit more of why you think this sort of framing is especially useful in putting it in terms of what we can produce here rather in terms of what we're currently buying on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with tariffs is that they're just very polarizing, right? Mm-hmm. Someone is benefiting from it and they really like it. And then someone is paying it and they really don't like it. And, I don't think that there's a realistic scenario of a holistic industrial policy, which includes trade policy, which includes tariff policy, where you don't have some level of tariff, especially on non-market competition and artificially induced supply, like, the metal sectors out of China. A tariff is absolutely going to be some level. It's going to be part of the solution. However, what I wanted to do with this report is, and I think we in the United States have when we talk about tariffs, it's an us versus them. It's a downstream versus supplier. Really, let's refocus this. This is the effects and consequences of non-market activity in China, right? And it's pitting Americans and American producers and manufacturers against each other in a way where we should, and I argue, and we tried to do this in our report, step back and say, hey, let's look at the bigger picture. This isn't about who pays the tariff and at what rate. And this is a tool in one of the tools in the toolkit in a holistic strategy to address what I think we should address, which is non-market industrial policies coming out of China that are good for them, but are having some pretty direct harms on some pretty important sectors in the United States. And what do we do about it? And so I think when you take a step back it's a little bit easier to have the conversation about, what tools, where, to what degree, and, how do we address this? Because, I think what we would argue is that the status quo is just going to lead to a lot of concentration of a lot of very critical supply chains to China. And I'm not sure, we would like that version of the world as Americans.
Yeah, what could go wrong with that? So Ben, this has been exactly the conversation we hoped for. Really enjoyed talking with you. Really appreciate your time. Before we let you go, the question we ask every guest, if you were to have the listener take one thing out of this report or our conversation, what do you think it would be?
It's a good question. We really need to start looking at industrial competitiveness and domestic production of critical strategic industrial materials like metals in a way that I think tries to match what we can produce with our own demand, right? And looks at it from a holistic perspective. I think what I was trying to do with this report is really, provide nuance, right? It's not just a tariff story. It's not just a China story, right? This is a problem that even China itself grapples with. What do we produce and how much? And so, what I'm hoping the readers can take away, there's a lot of nuance in here. And to really understand what the United States should be doing when it comes to industrial competitiveness. We absolutely need to be understanding what China is doing, because there's just a relationship there where, if you don't fully understand all of the policies and tools and the way to deploy them, I'm not sure we're going to be able to effectively mitigate or protect ourselves from some of the harmful effects of that. And so, getting that nuance into what they're doing, I think could help us get a more nuanced and effective and targeted and cost-efficient policy response to, how we should be thinking about it in exchange.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say about the report, so there's and we talked about this, you and me did, Ben, a couple months ago. We were talking about copper and what's been put out there. And one of the things that's great about your report, and I think I encourage readers to look at it, is whereas steel and aluminum, they have a lot of articles written or reports written about them by the OECD and really thorough and kind of robust analysis. Copper is one of those industries where it's just the data, the information, it's just kind of hard to come by. And so I think this is one of the real sources that for folks who are really interested in that sector in particular can come and find a rich vein of information. So that's the plug I'll put in for that. But Ben, you're author of The Strategic Surpluses, China's Economic Warfare on Major Metals, from the SAFE Center for Strategic Industrial Materials. Thank you for your time and for the work. Learn more about our work at prosperousamerica.org, and be sure to find us on YouTube, and you can check us out, the big three, on Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever you get your podcast.